and welcome to Unlimited Hangout. I'm your host, Whitney Webb. Today, throughout much of the world, a certain set of overarching policy goals that first revealed themselves during the COVID era continue to march forward, with political parties on the left and the right calling for those policies' implementation, albeit with different justifications. Digital IDs and their use to access online services, biometric control over national borders, unprecedented surveillance, and so-called predictive policing, the creation of a new carbon pricing scheme, an unprecedented effort to merge man with machine, the increased militarization of domestic policing, and much more are being rolled out in relative lockstep globally. However, many who were against these measures just a few years ago now seem to view them somewhat differently, as certain political figures have postured themselves as against these policies, but in reality, only really offer different sales pitches to the public for many of those same policies. This can also be seen on the international stage, where the apparent hostilities between West and East disappear when it comes to these same policy goals. The reason for this likely lies in the adoption by both the Western and Eastern power blocks of United Nations policy agendas, such as Agenda 2030 and the so called Sustainable Development Goals. While those goals themselves are worded to sound pleasant and as ensuring basic rights and needs, which is, of course, aided by the UN framing itself rather disingenuously as a place where national governments all have an equal seat at the table, the reality is really quite different, as we will discuss today. To understand where these policy goals come from and who the UN really serves, it is best to start by examining the genesis of that organization and its development over the past several decades. Joining me today to dissect the history of the UN and the current push into techno dystopia is Dr. Jacob Nordangard. Dr. Nordangard is a Swedish researcher and author who has now written 7 books, with the 7th coming out later this year in December, on how the incoming digital control system developed and unfolded, with a focus on the true nature of the United Nations and some of the most prominent oligarchs and that organization's development. You can find his books and other written works at jacobnordangard.se. Thanks for joining me today, Jacob, and welcome to Unlimited Hangout.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's absolutely my pleasure. So, to start off, for most people around the world, I would assume the United Nations is generally seen as a coming together of the national governments of the world, where global issues are addressed collectively and every country has an equal seat at the table. Why, in your view, is this perception inaccurate?
You just have to go back to the roots of United Nations. Who were the founders? Who were this organization set up? It's always those who are behind things that have a say in what the organization really is going to do. So it's like they have sold an idea of this perfect world order where everyone will have a say, but it's not like that. And if you go into to the background and how United Nations came about, it's a different story.
All right. So, with that being said, one of the earlier families, groups, oligarch clans, perhaps you could say, that had an outsized influence on the early development UN is the Rockefellers, which I know is a family you've written extensively about. So, how did the Rockefeller family and their affiliates influence the early United Nations, and what influence do they continue to hold over it?
Well, you can go back already to the League of Nations, the setup of the League of Nations, and the Rockefeller family was involved in this. And the undersecretary of the League of Nations was working with John D. Rockefeller Jr. already. And but as we know, the League of Nations was never United States was never a member. But they worked, Rockefeller Foundation worked very close with the League of Nations health department. It was like they set up everything. They had this international health division, the Rockefeller Foundation, and they more or less ran the operations of the League of Nations for the health agenda. And the same goes with the setup of the United Nations. As we know, the League of Nations was a failure, and during the 30s, Germany and Italy They quit the membership, and the organization had no abilities to stop a war, but at the same time they started to think about the possibilities to set up new organizations, and this was done through a lot of work of the Council on Foreign Relations in New York. And the Council on Foreign Relations, of course, was set up by J.P. Morgan and also the Rockefellers. And the Rockefellers were huge and very, very influential in these organizations from the 30s and onwards, and especially after the Second World War, they were dominating this organization. But before the war, CFR, they had this War and Peace study. There we discussed the possibility or how a new system would arise after the war that was about to start. It was the financial powers at that time. We knew that the time was more or less up for the British Empire, and this was a preparation for what would come afterwards. And so in this study, they mentioned the new financial institutions like what would become the World Bank and the IMF and so on. And also this started a process with a lot of meetings during the war about a new world organization. And it was also the fact that the Allied forces, they called themselves the United Nations, so they took that name later. And during the 1945, they had this big conference in San Francisco, and that was the kind of a setup of everything. And we have a big influence from the Rockefellers at that time. Nelson Rockefeller, the would-be vice president, was a part of this. And after they had made the decisions to start this, Nelson Rockefeller and the Rockefeller brothers, they came with a proposal that the new headquarters would be placed at their estate at Pocantico Hills outside of New York. But it was some of the other member countries that would be a part of this, and other people that was a part of the new organizations that said, oh, it's too far away from the city. We have to have it in they said we have to have it in inside New York. And so the Rockefellers, they bought the land for the headquarters. John D. Rockefeller then donated this property to the United Nations. And the Rockefellers also put up the architectural team that was responsible for the design of the headquarters. And their own chief architect was heading this. And he was the chief architect was also a member of both the Rockefeller Brothers Fund and the Rockefeller Foundation, the member of the board of trustees. So it was very, very close to home for them. And it's also with Rockefellers at just after the Second World War. I mean, they were so all the competitors had more or less been crushed by the war, but they were in the United States and had gained so much uh, power and wealth during the war. So they were very, very well prepared to take over the what you could say as the great work on building these new global governance structures. And the United Nations more or less became an organization that if you go into the Rockefeller capital management, uh, they are handling the financial affairs of the Rockefeller family. They have all these organizations that the Rockefeller has influenced and founded. And among them, they have United Nations in the middle. It's like, okay, this is our organization. So from the beginnings, from 1945, they have had a very, very, very big influence on the organization. And also, like in 1948, we have set up of a WHO, also very, very closely connected to the Rockefeller Foundation and their work. They basically took over the operations from the League of Nations. So very much into to steering the agenda at that time, and they also after the Second World War in the 50s, when they had the organizations, they started to think about how they could make United Nations more powerful. And during the or after the Second World War, it was a kind of a movement going on that talked about making the United Nations into a world government. It was the World Federalist Movement, it was called. It still operates today, but it was a failure. They couldn't convince the member states of United Nations at that time that they would give up or their sovereignty, and so they had to think about other ways to achieve this. And of course, we had Cold War coming, and that was actually the end of the idea of creating a world government at the time. But the Cold War was also making it clear for the nations that the atomic bomb could destroy the whole world, and therefore we have to have a kind of a global governance regime taking care of this and prevent this from happening. And a lot of these ideas stemmed from the University of Chicago, a university that was founded and funded by John D. Rockefeller, first John D. Rockefeller Sr., and later also when John D. Rockefeller died, John D. Jr. was involved, and David Rockefeller, and the Rockefeller money was very, very much in the University of Chicago. And at that university, they started something called the Doomsday Clock. You know the Doomsday Clock?
I'm familiar. Yeah. So basically, the alarmist group that says we're 1 minute or 2 minutes from midnight.
Yeah,
It's more or less
exactly.
been a very small amount of minutes from midnight ever since it was created, sort of creating this alarmism that's used to manufacture consent, I guess you could say, for solutions that people would otherwise not accept. That often leads to a surrendering of sovereignty per perceived gain against whatever the threat is said to be. Is that fair?
Exactly.
Okay.
So it was set up in 1947. They started this Doomsday Clock, and they also, from this university, we have very important people Robert Hutchins was the president of a university at that time. He was involved in the setup of the Aspen Institute in Colorado, and the Aspen Institute worked very close with the United Nations agenda. They were searching for problems, global problems. At first, the atomic bomb, but very close by, we started to talk about the population problem. It's a big thing. They
So, but
started.
before you go any further, then, since we're getting into, I guess, what is arguably the Rockefeller effort to rebrand their long interest in eugenics as something else entirely, what exactly has the Rockefeller family? I mean, they have a long standing history of what they've wanted to impose on the world. And obviously, from what you've said thus far, have sort of utilized entities like the United Nations to manufacture consent globally for a lot of those things. So, in addition to sort of this, some of the things you're touching on here, could you perhaps give an overview of essentially what their goals have been since at the very least, the early 20th century, if not a little bit earlier than that, and how sort of a quick overview, perhaps, of how they've attempted to use the United Nations or the NGO complex to sort of rebrand some of these longstanding ambitions as something more palatable to the public.
Yes. If you go into the Rockefeller history, it's all about oil in the beginning. And so Johnny Rockefeller starts Standard Oil, the Standard Oil Corporation, the more or less the biggest in the world, takes over the oil industry almost completely in the United States, and also becomes very, very influential globally. And that's important. They are operating globally and starting up a business more or less all over the world, and also interesting in securing the oil in other regions than the United States as well. So they are, it's like they are building up their own intelligence service.
They did have their own intelligence service actually during World War II. That was like a
Yeah.
competitor to the precursor to the CIA. So
Yes, yeah,
interesting.
operating from the Rockefeller Center. Uh, so they start up very, very early, interesting in because they are into global trade. That's what they're doing, global business. And one thing that they thought were impractical, it was that we have to in order to our business to make contract, we have to operate with governments all over the world. It's and also in the United States you have you couldn't do it only on the federal level. You have to be on the state level to and they thought they wanted a better structure. We wanted to it's like when you're lobbying, it's better to like we have it's in European Union now. First we had the countries, now we have Brussels, and every lobbyist is in Brussels, and we can the big corporations, they can more or less make policy with the help of the lobbyists and the politicians, and then these will be implemented in the member countries. And it's that kind of thinking. They want a more efficient system for the global business, and that's why we want to have this and have this on a global scale and global governance. And it's like they have used the United Nations for, and wants it to function as this in the future.
Well, I think it absolutely has become that. Actually, in some of my past work with Ian Davis for Unlimited Hangout and talking about the United Nations, we've referred to a what we consider a rather infamous quote from former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan that he gave, of course, when he was UN Secretary General at the end of the 1990s, saying the UN has undergone a quiet revolution, and I'm paraphrasing here, but it's something to the effect of, um, it's not really about the public sector of the world anymore. It's really about business, and the business
Yeah.
of the world's businesses is now the business of the UN, and essentially signaling that we serve the private sector in the public-private partnership model. Um, those
Yes.
those kind of things, and it makes a lot of sense when you consider that at the same time the Rockefellers are sort of posturing as through the UN as wanting a better, more just world and all of this
Yeah.
stuff. Some of the early things they were promoting at the UN basically came down to increased UN interest in what is often referred to, at least today, as the global south.
Mm.
And so in the case of, Latin America, for example, you have David Rockefeller, for example, sponsoring the coup in 1973 in Chile, installing Pinochet, and then having their economy be under the control of the university you just mentioned, the University of Chicago, with the implementation of what are known as the Chicago Boy policies. And then a lot of efforts, and a lot of that was facilitated by this network of businesses that the Rockefellers controlled. In Latin America, and one of their closest affiliates in Chile, a man named Augustine Edwards, who was a head of this Chilean banking dynasty, basically. And David Rockefeller at the time was head of Chase Manhattan Bank, which had very
Yeah.
predatory policy towards Latin America, helped spawn the Latin America debt crisis, which has led to a lot of the issues that we're still seeing today. Really, like Argentina's political instability, for example, has its antecedents in that era. And then there's this particular group that's, I think, very interesting to look at as well. They were known by this acronym called ADELA. And ADELA
Yeah.
is actually what
I know
spawned.
about it. Yeah.
Yes. Well, would you like to talk about it then? It did help spawn the Club of Rome, which I know is comes up quite a
Yes.
bit in your work. So, and the Rockefellers were involved in that as well. So I'd be interested to hear your take on ADELA.
Yes, Adela, they worked for more or less Latin American integration and cooperation between countries, but also it was like a lot of banksters involved in
Yeah.
this.
Yeah.
And we
Hmm.
also have also from my home country, Sweden, Marcus Wallenberg, the Swedish Rockefellers, it's Wallenbergs. I don't know how much you have looked into them, but they were they had this meeting, Adela, in I don't remember what country it was now, but they had a meeting with and they had this speech by a man called Aurelio Peccei.
Hmm.
He was the second guy at Fiat and at Olivetti, and also he had started one of the founders of Alitalia. And they at this speech he talked about the future development and how it was important to more or less control the future, because if these powerful people wouldn't do anything, it could spiral out of control. And for example, it was about population explosion, very very topical at the time, and also some other kind of environmental issues. And this, and he talked about how there was a need for more like high-tech revolution. And this, if you read the kind of history of the Club of Rome, they mention this. We don't know if it's exactly like this it happened, but they state this. And this speech to these banksters, we had one of those what was listening to this was Dean Rusk of the Rockefeller Foundation. He was, I think he was later Secretary of State, or
Under
maybe he was
Kennedy.
he was at this at the time, but he had been at the Rockefeller Foundation, so very close to the Rockefeller circle, and of course, and being part of something called the Special Studies Project in the 50s. And this led up to ideas on set up a kind of a think tank for the future and future development. And they had a first meeting in Rome.
I believe at a Rockefeller residence, right, in Bellagio?
No, the first was actually at the in Rome.
Oh, okay.
I don't remember the exact place. I was at this place last year. I was invited to go to Rome, and so I had to go to this place. But it's a very, very it's the oldest academy, more or less, in the world, and also has a connection to my own home country, Sweden, with our Queen Christina that went and lived in that place in the old building of this academy. She had her residence, and in that place, the first seed. It was decided to form this little group, the Club of Rome. And then they went to Bellagio a couple of months later, and that was where it really took off with a little core group. This was a planning event. It was global planners and system theorists that were gathered there to discuss more or less future development and how we can create a better system to govern the world. And after that, we have a lot of the Rockefeller people involved in this. First, it was of course the Bellagio Center run by Rockefeller Foundation, and but we also have one of the people in the board of trustees of the Club of Rome. In the circle was Carol Louis Wilson. He was a close friend of Nelson Rockefeller and also David Rockefeller, and had been involved in their special studies project in the 50s. But I think it's a very, very, very important thing with the special studies project. But the Club of Rome, Carol Louis Wilson was also, he was at the MIT, and he was responsible for setting up a study about resources, and population growth, and how the population growth would affect resources. It was very much based on Malthusianism ideas and computer modeling. That was the thing. So they built this computer model at the MIT, run by Jay Forrester, and this was the basis for the book Limits to Growth in 1972.
So before we go farther into limits to growth, I just want to add a few things. So first of all, my understanding of Adela, which helped, as you noted, help produce the Club of Rome and all of this, was essentially to invest. It was basically like Western oligarchs going to Latin America and king making, who would become the local oligarchs of those Latin American countries, sort of deciding who would become the big corporate magnates of that region. Which is interesting because there's actually another group that has followed that same model. called Endeavor, and they've actually they're mostly funded by the Bronfmans, involve Reid Hoffman,
Yeah.
and also Pierre Omidyar, the founder of eBay and a longtime owner of PayPal, though he is not doesn't currently own PayPal anymore. But they are essentially following that same model, but to basically king make the startups and companies that will be running all the fourth industrial revolution technology in Latin
Mm.
America. Um, which is interesting, but it really comes down, as you pointed out, to resource exploitation, how these people can control resources in countries that they really have no business doing that in, if you're coming at it from a sovereignty matters um, perspective. And then also trying to essentially frame population growth in these same areas like Latin America or the global South more broadly as threats to national security. So what you just referenced is really at the Club of Rome was also, you know, essentially in the same time frame, paralleled by another affiliate of the Rockefeller family, Henry Kissinger, in a
Yeah.
national
Mm.
security memorandum that he put out that during the Nixon administration basically made it U.S. government policy that unrestrained birth rates in Latin America and other areas of the global South were considered a threat to U.S. national security, uh, which is important to keep in mind in the context of all of this. So ultimately, you know, there's the longstanding Rockefeller interest in eugenics, but also, you know, kind of the view that you know, unrestrained population growth in these areas will essentially make it harder for, you know, these oligarch clans abroad to control their resources there at the end of the day. But somehow they've managed to rebrand this very disturbing and predatory ideology as some sort of you know, as sustainability and sustainable development and all of that. And you know, a
Yeah,
lot
and
of Mhm.
environmentalism yeah, and it made it very popular among people. They have implanted the idea among, I mean, especially in Sweden, we believe this. Everyone believes this dogma. So it's like the elite view. Uh, we have really taking uh, they have indoctrinated the minds of everyone to accept their own view, and this has been a strategy from the beginning. But I just wanted to, do you know about the special studies project that I mentioned?
I believe I'm familiar with it. Is that not where the David Rockefeller became acquainted with Henry Kissinger because of Kissinger's involvement in that program? Or it might
Yes.
have been a separate thing.
Uh, well, it was I think a special stuff is one of the key things in my Rockefeller book, because that's when they set up a lot of the agenda that's playing out during 60s and 70s and to this day. Uh,
Mhm.
and this was it was Nelson Rockefeller that wanted to. He had been in the Truman administration. He had been also, I think he was involved in the also Eisenhower, and but he uh, stepped out of politics for a while and wanted to become the chairman, the president of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, because he had at that time an idea. He wanted to bring the best minds in America together to discuss future problems and possibilities. And they had allocated funds for this. It was called the Special Project from the early 50s. And they started this in the mid 50s, 56, I think. And they recruited Henry Kissinger for as a coordinator and to take care of this. And we have a lot of people involved that is very, very high up in the ranks. And what they are doing with this, it's a thick report. It was released in the end as a book in 1961 called the Rockefeller panel reports. And in this, they talk about how to more or less create this new world and a global governance system for the future. They actually say in this report that their mission was to shape a new world order in all its dimensions, economic, political, cultural, and so on. And how to do this? They said that science is a method, because science it's something we have scientific cooperation between nations over borders, and we have to seek out scientific problems that are global in scope. So in this special studies project, we say that, okay, we have some areas that are more interesting to develop than others. And some of these are meteorology and oceanography, because climate spans over borders. It's a transnational problems. And we also say that if we somehow could change the climate, it would be a problem that would needed. It couldn't be solved by a nation alone. And the next thing is global health. And of course, the third one is the atomic bomb. But it's so they say they have to fund these scientific areas. And they have already been doing that, of course, with health for a long time. But now in the 50s, it becomes a priority with climate change and the carbon dioxide theory that they that was not a big issue at this time, but it became, and they were very, very heavily involved in setting up this from the 50s and onwards, and then through the Club of Rome, that was one of the main vehicles. And as I said before, Carol Louis Wilson was a part of this special studies project, and he was the one that commissioned two big conferences in the early 1970s that talked about critical environmental problems and man's impact on the climate. And he was a close friend of Nelson and David. And more or less, when if you read what's written about him by the climate scientists of that time, they say that he was the one that made us interesting about these topics and how man was responsible for influencing climate. So it became very obvious, and it's kind of a shock for me when I found out this. I was at the climate Center for Climate Science and Policy Research in my home city here in Norrköping, and it was strange to see that, okay, these people, wait a minute, these are the old oil men that were behind this. So
well, it kind of does make sense when you consider that the modern environmental movement is almost exclusively focused on carbon emissions, and not on the toxic load caused by industries like big oil, for example, that the Rockefellers made a lot of their wealth from. Or, for example, I mean, there's an infinite number of major environmental issues the world faces, from just contamination from mining, for example, contamination from things like hydraulic fracturing or fracking, as it's known in the US, which totally destroys the water table. Um, and like just pumps a ton of really toxic stuff that companies don't even have to disclose into the water and into the earth and all of this stuff, and it's essentially made it the big issue. And of course, when you have that extreme focus on carbon emissions, the solutions that have been given to us are essentially technocratic efforts to manage people's footprints through organizations downstream of the Club of Rome, like the Global Footprint Network, and then all these efforts to create carbon pricing schemes, which are essentially ways to create new markets, and basically through the narrative about through this the fear generated around climate change, use that as a way to impose this new market onto nations, essentially. And it's interesting because the figure that was very important and getting those solutions to be the predominant UN-backed solutions for climate change and things like that was Maurice Strong. And the man that Maurice Strong chose to hire to develop carbon emissions trading, and he worked on developing the Kyoto Protocol with, is a guy named Richard Sandor, who had previously been an executive vice president at Drexel Burnham Lambert, which was in the center of a huge financial scandal just like 2 years prior, basically, for the junk bond scam. And several people at Drexel went to prison. Some became convicted felons. And Sandor made a lot of money off of that. And he's also the father of financial futures and derivatives, and a lot of other,
Yeah.
financial instruments that have caused economic calamity. But he's the father of carbon trading, and he thinks also that we should privatize, the world's access to clean water and clean air. That there should be
Yeah.
a market for that as well. And this is why it's very frustrating to me for people who I think are environmentalists and are well motivated. If the alarm is such as described by all of these figures and organizations that you're citing, why are the solutions all of these scammy carbon pricing schemes that don't actually, even if you believe the official climate change narrative, don't actually address that narrative at all?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's a big scam, and I think it's. I mean, I know a lot of people working with this, and it's not bad people. A lot of my old colleagues from university, so they all work with this. They believe in it, and I guess they think I've gone crazy or something, but. But it's like, but I have tried all the time to just show the evidence for this, but it's very, very, very hard for uh, believers to, even if you show them this, they can't. And it's like they have invested so much in this climate narrative that they can't. It's impossible for them to do other things, or question it. If we question it, they question the very existence of institutions we work in. So it's very, very hard to change this, unfortunately.
Well, I think it's useful to focus on the proposed solutions from the people that are
Yeah.
propagating or the genesis figures in this narrative. So for example, someone like Bill Gates, who's become relatively notorious, he says the solution to climate change is not to plant forests all over the world. Don't plant trees, he says. Instead, he
Mm.
thinks it's a much better idea to pay some company to use fossil fueled powered large digging machines to pull up trees in an existing forest, and then use untold numbers of fossil fuels to then bury those trees underground so that the carbon is quote unquote sequestered, even though the trees alive would technically turn that carbon into oxygen, right? And he's like, no, no, you can't do that. We have to, these startups that I've been investing in and funding, we have to use their solutions. and things like that. And also, I think it's useful to point out that the UN, when you look at a lot of things they're facilitating and supporting, absolutely go against common environmental um, sense, like their facilitation, for example, of deep sea mining. At a time when they're claiming to be extremely worried and arguably rightly so about the environmental crises facing the world's oceans, right? But a lot of
Yeah.
those issues, like deep sea mining or extreme plastic pollution, have taken an extreme backseat to concerns about carbon emissions. And the idea that anyone, that takes the climate change narrative seriously thinks that those issues could be addressed by a carbon tax or a carbon market, I think are really need to look at what these solutions that are being offered actually do. And also the fact
Yeah,
that
of
people who
course.
claim to be against climate change, like figures relatively close to the Trump administration, are, along with the Global Footprint Network, that Club of Rome affiliate I mentioned earlier, are trying to build a giant carbon market on Latin America with the goal of regionally integrating it basically into like a Latin American union, and building a intercontinental smart power grid connecting North, Central, and South America, all and then surveilling all of the forests on the entire
Yeah.
continent as part of this like carbon scheme that they call Green Plus, basically. And on the satellite company involved, intimately involves Trump's transition team co-chair Howard Lutnick, who's now going to be his commerce secretary, as well as his former Treasury Secretary Steve Mnuchin and the former head of
Mm.
the Joint Chiefs of Staff of the military under Trump, Joe Dunford, all on the board of that. Interestingly enough. And their goal is to put it all on a Bitcoin side chain and essentially have these carbon emissions be traded, but the local communities it's supposed to benefit can't actually control the money they supposedly receive from it, and they only can implement projects with it that are approved by the Global Footprint Network and this other, a kind of overtly globalist entity called CC35, which is basically trying to regionalize Latin America under the guise of combating climate change. And actually, a leading figure in Nayib Bukele's party in El Salvador, Mario Duran, is a vice president of that organization. So a lot of these supposed like right-leaning figures that have been claiming to be right-leaning populists seem to be all in for the carbon trading thing, which please explain that one, against the narrative. Again, it's a market, and it seems to be big business and about resource control at the end of the day. And I suppose when you're focusing on emissions and global footprint, that's a very convenient way to be able to exercise control over a country or community's industrial activity and their energy
Yeah.
usage. And there's a direct correlation between energy usage, ability, and family size, which takes
Mm.
us sort of back to the whole quote unquote family planning endeavor.
Yes. Yeah, it's all connected. I mean, and carbon, it's perfect. Carbon is life. Carbon is energy. Carbon is everything. If you, and that's why it has become so important for them to make it our new religion.
Well, I also there's just so many examples where it just doesn't make sense. So, why are a lot of these, big names coming out and saying, no, we can't do small scale organic agriculture or family
Mm.
farms. We instead have to have giant industrial farms that are managed by AI and drones and involve no people. Like that's the more climate change friendly solution. Um, Is that so? I don't know. I mean, a lot of these, frankly, just seem like they're being foisted on people who are, concerned about a particular narrative that's been propagated. But there seems to be a lot of, or rather, a lack of critical thinking about these solutions and do they really address the problem that's been posed to most people. And it seems like there is a massive disconnect there. So maybe we should talk a little bit about the man that helped make this happen. I mentioned him earlier. His name is Maurice Strong, and he was responsible for, well, essentially for the precursors for what are now the Sustainable Development Goals that have gone through a few iterations, but I guess ultimately go back to Agenda 21 which was launched at this Rio conference in the early 1990s. But Maurice Strong has an interesting history, definitely has a lot of Rockefeller connections, and I was wondering if you'd be interested in talking about him at all.
Yes, Maurice Strong. When I started to read about him, he was first a bit critical about the Rockefeller influence, but he was kind of dragged into the net, and he was a lawyer, but and he was came into the energy business side of it, and it was kind of a strange thing. You could say that he was the man they chose for the Stockholm Conference in 1972, the big United Nations meeting. That was the first that was all for the environment, first proposed in 1967 by a Swedish diplomat called Sverker Åström. But they had worked more or less behind the scenes with the Americans. And the Americans were the people from the Aspen Institute with Joseph Slater and Robert O. Anderson. Robert O. Anderson, he was an oil executive from the Atlantic Richfield Corporation. And they set up kind of an institute, the Institute of Environmental Affairs, International Institute of Environmental Affairs, and Maurice Strong came into the picture, was recruited for this. He hadn't been talking that much about environment before, but he had been involved with the Canadian, what's it called, foreign aid agency. And so that's because this conference was a lot about future development, or how can we control development. So Maurice Strong, he was invited to be the Secretary General for the conference. They had this American team coming to Stockholm. It was officially Sweden that was, and the Swedish government that would run this, but Maurice Strong and the secretariat that was funded by Rockefeller Foundation. We also find a lot of Rockefeller connected people involved in this. And before the Stockholm conference, they had also a couple of meetings to secure the interest, or secure, you wanted to convince the third world countries that this was a good idea with environment and development, and to have this big international conference, because the thing, they were kind of skeptical, were very skeptical, a lot of these countries, because it was okay, so now it's the old colonial powers that are going to tell us how we can develop in the future. Maybe not a good idea. But Maurice Strong was sent with Barbara Ward to have something called the Phoenix meeting. They decided that we have to the third world countries, they will be allowed to develop. We have development in the mix, so these countries will have something as well. But of course, what they thought of themselves was the resources, to control the resources. And in Stockholm, it was interesting with Maurice, because I actually read. I have this book that the Swedish Foreign Office published a couple of years ago. That it's a Swedish diplomat who writes about all the what's happening behind the scenes, from more or less Stockholm, the Stockholm conference to the Rio conference, and a lot of things with Maurice Strong. And Maurice Strong, he actually had a close contact with the Swedish royals. So he had meetings at the Swedish royal castle a couple of times. So very, very, and it's just interesting to see these kind of people, because it's not like when we set up this conference, they also wanted to make it appear like we have these grassroots movements that are demanding change. So at the same time, they founded the Friends of the Earth. Just I think it was 69. And do you know who gave them the money to to Friends of the Earth? This environmental organization that is known to be anti-capitalist and very, very radical. Do you know the name?
No, I'm not familiar.
Oh no, Robert O. Anderson, the oil executive from the Atlantic Richfield Corporation, gave seed money to this little organization, and they were more or less created to give this, because before this, the environmentalists were more in the upper class, and they were into natural parks development, and they were concerned about population growth, of course. They were into eugenicist thought and and these things. Not kind of a popular view, but during the end of the 60s, they changed this, and they set up the Friends of the Earth, and also we have this book, The Population Bomb, that was published in, I think it was 69 as well. And to give this impression that we have this all these grassroots demanding that we less people on Earth, and that we are destroying Earth, and Earth has to be controlled. We also have a lot of metaphors coming up at the time, and books called Spaceship Earth and so on. But Earth is a little small planet, and it has to be manned by a crew that can steer it in the right direction, and it's so fragile and everything. So and in the middle of this comes Maurice Strong, and he we also have actually in Stockholm a kind of a place. It's a former air base that they set up a camp with youth, and they actually have this Americans coming over, like hippie types, and coming up with drugs and stuff, just to make it this like youth rebellion movement, and Maurice Strong comes out and talks to these youthsters and everything, and cameras everywhere, just to give this impression. And Maurice Strong, he effectively managed this conference, and the conference at the end, they decide that Maurice will head a new environmental bureau, the United Nations Environmental Program. So, and this was also a goal from this Aspen Institute and International environmental I forgot the name. Okay, Aspen Institute. The Robert O. Anderson and Joseph Slater and all these people, very, very, very connected to the oil industry, everybody. it's kind of funny. Just and after this,
Well, it continues today. I mean, some of the biggest promoters currently of, carbon offsets, carbon emissions trading, and a lot of these proposed solutions are big oil and big gas. And some of the biggest benefactors from the Biden administration's very controversial Inflation Reduction Act, which was largely climate change, quote unquote, related legislation, were actually oil companies, including one that backed Trump very
yeah,
heavily called Occidental Petroleum, which has a very controversial history because of its very intelligence connected longtime head, a guy named Armand Hammer. Um, and his involvement with people like Samuel Pisar of the Robert Maxwell Network and their goal, along with, they were affiliated with Kissinger and largely this Rockefeller group as well, to create basically the world of the trans ideological corporation, as how Pisar put it, basically like knitting together
yeah. You said Occidental. Was it
Occidental Petroleum, it's
Occidental?
called.
Yeah, yeah. Nelson Rockefeller was a part of
Right, right,
Occidental,
right.
and also
So
Al Gore.
yeah, not surprising either. But
Yeah.
basically, they've become a huge benefactor of carbon sequestration subsidies and things of that nature. And a lot of the I think the biggest lobbying group for carbon emissions trading, the oldest one, it's called IETA. It's all the biggest oil companies in the world
Yeah,
are there. So
it
the
is.
idea that big oil and big gas are against these kind of solutions, I mean, as you've been pointing out, they've really been behind this shift in environmental consciousness, for a very long time, and they stand to arguably benefit the most from what's being described as a post-oil era. But they designed the post-oil era,
Yeah, we did,
right?
and that's the thing. What surprised me, I was once an environmentalist. I was once a member of the Green Party in Sweden and everything. And I thought at that time that, okay, it's the environmental movement. They have actually changed things. They started to complain about how these big corporations were polluting the environment and doing all this bad stuff. But it, when I really started to digging into it, it was, oh no, they actually started the environmental movement.
Well, I think there were environmental movements, before this era, and you had people focused on, at least the United States, a lot of chemical issues, for example, or like use of pesticides that were killing off,
Yeah,
um,
yes, yes.
native wildlife and things like that. And now that has, as I said earlier, has completely taken a back seat to this other stuff. And I think it absolutely is possible to be an environmentalist without, supporting carbon emissions trading or a carbon tax or carbon pricing schemes.
I would say that the difference is that we have local environmental problems and we have local groups, and these have been always and now we have real environmentalists that they are worried about the big wind farms and the destruction of the environment and the forests in Sweden to build these. But these are local groups. But uh, what I talk about is the global, the big
The moneyed
movements.
environmental
I
movement.
mean, we have the big. It's like they are more like transnational companies themselves, like what Greenpeace became and Friends of the Earth. They have these offices in Amsterdam, and they always only talk about the big global problems. They don't talk about small local problems that we can do something about that really affects people in their daily life. It's just these big problems that you don't can see. You can't see the how the climate. You that's invisible threats. So it's a difference. So of course we have real environmentalists. I would say that I myself is a real environmentalist, but I was kind of scared of seeing that a lot of things that I believed in, it was no problems. It was no real problems, and that the real problems was kind of, no, that's not important. And I witnessed the change in the Green Party in Sweden as well, when they suddenly at first they were very much into local solutions and caring about these small problems that were close to people, and instead only started to talk about climate change, and also start to say that no, before we were against the European Union, but uh, now, because of the climate, we have to be a part of the European Union. So they abandoned every criticism at that time. So and also the people involved in the party, they started to talk about technocratic solutions. It was like they were totally hijacked, and now I think a lot of these people that were involved have quit the party and are now in the more alternative movement.
Yeah, well, that kind of makes sense, honestly, because it is very frustrating to see a lot of things happen and what are sold as solutions
Yeah,
to environmental crises, and they're flagrantly predatory, and there's really no pushback on them at all, except for the handful of us that write about green finance and alternative media.
yeah,
Like, as an example, one of the most frequently floated solutions these days, and that's supported by these predatory multilateral banking institutions like the World Bank and the IMF and what have you, are things like climate debt for climate swaps,
yeah,
debt for
yeah,
nature
yeah.
swaps, or
Mm,
essentially, these multilateral development banking institutions that were created, at the same time the UN essentially was created at the close of the World War by, again, a lot of the same people involved there, have been used to essentially attack less wealthy countries with a form of debt slavery. And now they're using that debt slavery to get people to essentially give away their natural resources to either foreign banks or foreign corporations or foreign NGOs, under the guise of conservation, but that's really not what's happening at all, because it's a retooling of something that was pitched in the 1980s, the debt for land swap,
yeah, yeah.
which is
Mm,
basically just a way to steal land. And Argentina in particular has been a big um, target of that for some time, but it's also, really Latin American wide. And essentially all of those
mm,
programs have been beta tested most extensively in Latin America, but of course also in Africa, as well, which is another major target of it. And essentially what happens when these agreements happen is that locals are unable to access the environment. So for example, a lot of the coastal ones that manage like coastal marine environments as part of these debt for climate swaps prevent locals from accessing the beach at all or engaging in local fishing or anything like that. And they're essentially designed to, uh, you know, force locals out of the way they've been living for a very long time, which is arguably sustainable, right?
mhm, mm,
But sort of force them into other means and allow a lot of these big banks that are ultimately behind a lot of the stuff to sort of price to sort of sell these ecosystems as blue carbon credits when they're marine ecosystems, or green carbon credits when when they're forests, and all of this is as part of these sort of efforts to sort of add what they call natural assets to their balance
mm,
sheets and what have you, since it allow as I've written before, there's this idea of, and it comes downstream of the Rockefeller Foundation as well, this whole idea of, for example, the Natural Asset Corporation, and taking control of natural assets that were previously part of the public commons. The goal is to essentially financialize nature, but have it essentially be bought by people who don't live there. And this has been getting really crazy to the point where you now have a company that's run by a former BlackRock executive that invented exchange traded funds, or ETFs, is turning each hectare of the Amazon rainforest into a security that you can buy, with a guy that used to
mm,
be a board
mm,
member of Trump's Truth Social parent company. And and essentially what they're doing to locals is that they have local indigenous groups living in the Amazon sign these contracts in exchange for what's essentially very little money in terms of what they're giving away. I think it's like $10,000, and they lose sovereignty over their land. The company doing the securitization of the Amazon which is called One Amazon, can bring any group they want into the forest without the local people knowing or having to give their consent. They're under constant surveillance because One Amazon is also aiming to wire up the entire Amazon to some sort of internet grid that they call the Internet of Forests. So, like the Internet
Yeah.
of Things,
Mm.
but for the Internet of Trees, basically. And
Yeah.
they say it's about conservation, but they also say in a separate white paper that it's about harvesting the biological data from the trees and then
Yeah.
monetizing that so they
Yeah.
can make more money.
Mm.
And essentially, these indigenous people lose their sovereignty and are under constant surveillance from from foreign powers, really, in exchange for a one-time payment of like $10,000. While these guys are going to laugh all the way to the bank by securitizing the whole rainforest and covering it with sensors and stuff. And drone swarms. Doesn't that
Yeah.
sound environmentally friendly?
Yeah.
So,
Of course.
but this is
And
unfortunately what a lot of people are getting. And I do get frustrated with people who are very unwilling to question the solutions that are being foisted upon us. Because for people that are concerned about the environment, how
mm,
do you not see that it's absolutely bonkers? And
yes.
so I hope someday people on the left will start to figure it out. I mean, there's plenty of people on the right that have figured things out to an extent. But again, there's a lot of prominent right wing figures, at least with the incoming Trump administration in the US. You know, there are figures that are set to serve in that administration that are openly committed to implementing the SDGs, like Howard Lutnick, who I mentioned earlier. His company,
Mm.
Cantor Fitzgerald, has a whole fund dedicated to SDG implementation and quote unquote sustainability. And, you know, Elon Musk, for example, a big proponent of carbon taxes for a very long time. And of course, an electric vehicle magnet, among
Yes, I
other
mean,
things.
yeah, he has earned a fortune on climate policy with
Yeah. So
with changing the cars to electric ones. It's yeah,
right, which comes with a major environmental cost as well, all of the mining for the cobalt, the
yeah,
nickel,
mm,
and the lithium required. That environmental cost is very substantial and doesn't really get discussed very often, does it? But I suspect there's going to be
no,
an
yeah,
effort, even though Trump has framed himself in the past as a climate skeptic, pulling out of the Paris Agreement and things like that. It seems like I think it's very likely that in the next administration you're going to see some form of carbon pricing or carbon emissions trading, which were originally Republican ideas anyway. It was George H.W. Bush.
and this time, has Trump talked anything about the Paris Agreement this time?
No, and actually, Elon Musk quit the advisory boards he was on in the previous Trump administration, saying, "You quit Paris, I quit you," to Trump. But they've teamed up again, so I guess
Yeah.
their differences there must have been
They have already
resolved.
played that card.
Yes, and then
Yeah.
Howard Lutnick, who I mentioned earlier, who's essentially helped chosen the entire Trump cabinet and is now going to serve in it, was one of the earliest pioneers of carbon emissions trading, and also its precursor, sulfur emissions trading, under the first Bush administration. But you know, they created a whole electronic carbon trading platform like as soon as the Kyoto Protocol was signed in the late '90s, and have operated that ever since. So we'll see what happens. Um, anyway, I there are some other things in your work that I do want to cover before we run out of time. So if we could pivot to some other things that are related to the United Nations, but not necessarily its role in hijacking modern environmentalism, I would like to do that if that's okay with you.
Yeah, yeah, of
Great.
course.
So
Yeah.
you've written a good bit on some of the recent UN pacts and documents that have come out, one of which is the UN Our Common Agenda document. And that reveals what some of the UN's policy goals are if the UN succeeds in obtaining what it calls multilateralism with teeth, meaning the power to enforce its policies on member states, whether they want it or not. And these include a universal digital ID, an apex body for the global economy, behavioral design techniques, space technology to monitor carbon emissions, which we talked about a minute ago, among others. So, in my opinion, in the US and beyond, we're seeing an effort to sell a lot of these policies to both the left and right including to those who were concerned just a few years ago when, during the COVID era, and there was the formal announcement of the Great Reset and so on. So, what are your feelings about that? Do you think that's happening as well, or do you think there is some sort of force that's publicly not pushing to implement these policies?
Yes, I can't see that we have someone that really is pushing against this. If you look into this process with our common agenda, it's been going on for a long time, and we had this Pact for the Future in just 2 months ago, almost to the day, actually, and it was very, very little resistance to this, and this was a document agreed upon. Before, it was no vote on the outcome document. There were some countries that had some concerns about it, but in the end, they gave in, and maybe some of the things included in the pact or proposed were not part of the end document. But it's not like it's not. But it's a tiny part. The pact is huge. It's a lot of things covered in this. So a lot of this they have already agreed upon, and and I see this as a Fabian method with all these small steps all the time. So
Gradualism.
gradualism, yeah, exactly, and also it's like. When you negotiate, you aim for a lot. You say I want. It's like Donald Trump is doing negotiating. He aims very high, and those in the other end of a negotiation, they go the middle way, and they feel okay. We didn't get that. Those bad things in the end, but they got a lot because that's how you do it when you negotiate. You come up with all these solutions that can feel like far out ideas, but and your opponent feel that they have won something. So I see that everything that also has been proposed will come back at a later time. It's like they had this one of the big things in our common agenda and the Pact for the Future is the emergency platform. I think that's the one of the most dangerous things they have come up with, which is essentially giving United Nations Secretary General the right to declare a global emergency, and that will make their predetermined actors that we have decided upon big corporations and governments and institutions and academia and NGOs, a group, a network that will act upon command when this emergency is declared, and following protocols to the detail, and not tolerating any opposing view. That's very, very really scary shit. And they actually wanted to have the Club of Rome and these people, something called the Climate Governance Commission. A lot of Club of Rome people and also Trilateral Commission people involved. They wanted to have this declaration, a global emergency, already 2 months ago at this Summit of the Future. Didn't happen, but it's like, but they prepare the world for such an event. Now they have forced people to talk about. We have the United Nations system is adjusting itself, preparing, and all in the background we all have all these things happening, and also I was just reading through a document from the Swedish government, because they are preparing a change in the constitution that gives the government the right to declare an emergency without the parliament involved. So and that's also a reason that Sweden were kind of more soft in their approach during the pandemic. We didn't have those tools for the government. All was based on recommendations. But now they are preparing for. So I think this. But we said we want a global emergency declared now. Okay, but the nations are not completely ready, because they have to have legislation in place before. So this emergency platform that wasn't a part of the pact, it was just United Nations will come up with proposals on how to solve a big global emergency if it comes, and we will decide later. It's like I think it will spring up at a later date, perhaps. And I've written about this in a couple of articles about the Summit of the Future, the Pact for the Future, that the incoming Trump administration and also the new European Union administration, they will have to deal with a couple of global crises, maybe what they refer to as polycrisis. Yeah. So it will be okay. We didn't get what we wanted this time, but I think even if they had this emergency platform established now, they would still have a global emergency. It's to test it. But this time we don't have it, so now we have to have this global polycrisis to show the world the need for this emergency platform. So that's one of the big things. So if you actually look into all the political processes that is going on around, like the United Nations, you can see that they all have prepared a lot of things already for the next step in this. And for example, they decided upon a change in the organization, United Nations 2.0. That is, and that's, you talked a lot about this with surveilling the forest and so on, and that comes into this because it's essentially about this construction of a world brain. I've written a lot about it, and I wrote an article in the same Solar report that you did about the world brain, the digital world brain, and that's what I see is the goal. That is the end goal, to have this more or less perfect system that gives these people, these billionaire people, this United Nations bureaucrats and the technocrats, and the possibility to actually look into the future with a collection of every data and
all the data, yes,
all the data, and also this with there's a lot of preparation now for artificial intelligence, the next step.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
And I think there's going to be an unprecedented effort to sell it in certain countries differently as well. So I think you're absolutely right about the goal for the UN to be sort of a de facto digital world brain, because ultimately a lot of the work that I've done, most of it in collaboration with Ian Davis, has focused on
Yeah,
how a lot of the efforts to, for example, market digital IDs is going to be framing it as decentralized and vendor agnostic, but ultimately the standards of all the digital IDs are going to be the same globally, and they can export their data in the same format, and certain entities, uh, generally the UN or groups like the World Bank, affiliates, are going to be housing the bulk of that data for all the countries. So the idea as it appears right now is to sort of give the appearance that it's not the same system, but the
yeah,
data will be harvested and sent to the same place and then used, by that whatever entity is housing it to, to be analyzed, to develop um, certain AI algorithms and to, make, policy, uh, technocratic policy decisions from that data, and then have them be sold elsewhere. And I think they're going to try and, I don't know, market those under different metrics to different populations. So obviously, the way they'd market it in China versus the United States, I think, is going to be, quite different. And so, but I think you can see sort of what the marketing pitches are for digital ID. If you
yeah.
look at the Five Eyes countries, for example, which
Mm.
which is basically the English speaking world. So in places like the United Kingdom or Australia, when the current Australian government is pushing through, digital ID for verification, to access social media under the guise of protecting kids from online harm. It's very similar, the argument in Britain as well, at least when it's the Labour Party doing the talking. Or they'll say it's hate speech as well, protecting
Mm.
you from hate speech. But in the conservatives, the opposition, ostensible opposition in Britain, for example, marketed the same policy essentially, but as a solution to illegal immigration.
Yeah,
Right. And so obviously, right leaning bases in the West are concerned about illegal immigration, which has been allowed by both left and right to happen. And they argue that that is the only solution for that. And that is true also in the United States, where Donald Trump has proposed a biometric entry exit tracking system that he says is very precise. For anyone that's coming into or out of the US, which includes any American citizen that wants to travel abroad. So, not just foreigners.
yes.
And that
Oh,
this would be a way to control illegal immigration. But ultimately, it's the same policy. You get stuck with the same crap at the end of the day, but the way it's being sold to you is different. And I think meant to appeal to different demographics, particularly those who might resist that policy more.
yeah, exactly. I mean, it's the same in Sweden. Uh, we had a conservative government uh, like 10 years ago, uh, and we had a prime minister. He said, "We have to open our hearts. We have to let all these people in Sweden and be generous." And when he left the office and the Social Democrats came to power, a new prime minister, and then we had this big refugee crisis, and it was so problematic everywhere. And a couple of years later, we had lots of criminality, lots of problem, lots of shootings, bombings, and everything. Things that hadn't happened in Sweden before, and even in my home city, it's gangs shooting at each other, and outside my grocery store that I go to almost every day, a young boy was shot to death, and it was such horrible things going on. And 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 the social democrat government, they couldn't handle it, and they said, okay, we have to stop immigration. So uh, we have to do something. And became problematic with the government because the Green Party didn't like this. They wanted the immigrants to come to Sweden, and so and then the Social Democrats lost power because of this, and instead the Conservatives came to power again. Remember now, the prime minister, before the Conservative, he said, "Open your hearts, let the people in." Then the problem hit, and then comes the new Conservative Party, not the same prime minister as that time, but a new. And he says, "Now we're going to take care of this, the immigrants. We're going to the criminality." And they decided very, very quickly when we came to power, together with a populist party in Sweden called the Sweden Democrats, that got a huge following of people that were tired of what happening with the immigrant wave. And now they said, we're going to have more policing, we're going to have more surveillance, and put cameras everywhere. So now they had this decision earlier this year, or it was late last year, that now it's allowed to have these security zones, and also put up cameras on the streets that we didn't have before. And it took, I think, 2 days before they put up this new security all over town. So it's obvious how they are doing this, and also how it doesn't matter who's in power, who's in charge, the left or the right. The left, of course, they will use the digital ID for the environmental concerns or health concerns, and the right will do it out of concern of the people, the immigrants. So
Well,
yeah.
I think once it's there, they're going to try and mix them all together. So, like the
Yeah,
World Bank,
yeah,
for example,
of
is
course.
poised right now, at least seemingly, to be one of the main data depositories for digital ID globally with its ID40 database. And they're also in the process of developing blockchain-based climate wallets.
Yeah,
Isn't that nice?
yeah,
So,
very.
it so it seems like the goal is sort of to link them together. And there's also, I think one thing that gets left of the equation, because there's plenty of people that talk about the digitalization of money, but it really goes hand in hand with the efforts to, financialize nature and turn nature into tradable financial products, under the guise of combating climate change, because then there can be monetary incentives for you to have your climate wallet. You can get who knows what token that's based on. I mean, the scammy
Yeah.
guy that used to run WeWork, right, came back with a carbon market scam and produced the goddess nature token, right? So you
Mm,
can, hold some of those and feel like you're saving the environment and whatever, while you get your de facto CBDC and things like
yeah,
that. And I
yeah.
think it's important to keep in mind in discussing all of this that the name of the game, and the UN has said it itself, is the public-private partnership. And just like they like to ping pong us around by going from left to right whenever it suits them, or whenever people get tired and fed up with one of the sides, they do that too with the public-private thing. And so I think, concerns, for example, about a central bank digital currency, which would be a public sector, right, digital
Mm,
currency. There's been a lot of a dramatic lack of focus on private sector digital currencies that are just as Orwellian and surveillable and programmable as CBDCs would be, and stable coins, for example,
yeah.
and how these are being, pushed around under similar metrics and could easily be interfaced with some sort of, carbon emission, carbon limiting, finance edict that's eventually foisted upon us. But really, I think, the cornerstone of a lot of these agendas are digital ID. I think about roughly half of all of the SDG indicators can't be implemented without a digital
Mm,
ID, which is why I think it's so important to opt out of that, and that people should really be focusing on that instead of, what certain politicians are saying and doing,
yeah.
because they seem to all agree on the policy agendas, at least once they're in power. And, even though they frame it under different metrics perhaps and have different sales pitches, but if digital ID fails to be widely adopted, then this whole agenda essentially will have a lot of difficulty going forward, and they have to sell it as voluntary, at least at first. So I think there's a lot of hope in that endeavor. So before we run out of time, I did want to touch base about a couple other things that you've brought up in the context of your work on the global digital brain and things of that nature. So in some of your work, you've mapped out the effort of UN linked figures over the decades that have called for a development of a new global consciousness, and along with it, an effort to sort of homogenize thought and culture. So how did this techno-spiritual policy develop, and what is the end goal? And do you see this homogenization as already happening to some degree?
Well, these ideas sprang out of the Club of Rome, and
Hmm.
a guy called Irving Laszlo, that's a system theorist and heavily involved in United Nations, and was responsible for the new international economic order project at the United Nations in the 70s. And they discussed at the Club of Rome how we could to develop a new global consciousness. And he came up with the idea and started an organization called the Club of Budapest in 1992 or 1993, right after the Rio meeting in Rio de Janeiro, the meeting that was headed by Maurice Strong, and the Agenda 21. That when the Agenda 21 doctrine was born, and Laszlo and the Club of Budapest, they started to work with a lot of influential people, and among them were Mikhail Gorbachev, the former leader of the Soviet Union, and they also contacted a lot of people involved in culture, of course, and also religious leaders to fuse together these ideas, and started to talk about how a global culture could flourish. And they also were involved, a lot of these people, in something called the Great Transition Initiative, that essentially talked about how can we create this new planetary society with this global consciousness. They released a report in 2002 called The Great Transition. Funding came from the Rockefeller Foundation, United Environmental Program, and also, as always, as I cover a lot in my Rockefeller book and other books, a very close Swedish connection with the Stockholm Environment Institute. And they said that in order to create this new planetary civilization, we have to have a movement. We have to create a movement of people that have this new identity, but don't have the national identities. They have to have a new common global identity, and they started to fund a lot of NGOs that were operating to change people, and also to connect people with these ideas. And this was called the Widening Circle, and started in, I think it was in 2006. And what's interesting also with this global transition, it was that they said that in order to change, there will be a lot of crisis coming. And we know what happened in 2001, just before this report came out. Irving Laszlo actually wrote and published a book called Macro Shift in the 9th September of 2001. And at the same day, we had a meeting in Vermont. There they had we celebrated the Earth Charter at that meeting, and they had an artist that had created a new, like the Ark of the Covenant, but where they placed this Earth Charter, and that's kind of this global consciousness mindset and these ideas, and they placed it in this new covenant. And when the 9/11 attack happened, they decided to take this covenant in a procession, taking a walk all the way from Vermont to New York, and they wanted to place it in United Nations headquarters. But for some reason, it was not possible to put it there at that time, so they put it in the God box. And the God box, that's the nickname of the interfaith house in very close Morningside Heights, Morningside Drive, I think it's called, very close to Columbia University. And that's where the Rockefeller Brothers Fund has their office. So we put this new covenant there. And if you go into Irving Laszlo, and because it's a lot of other things that's happening, where they also talk about technology and how we're going to create this global consciousness, because one thing has been through the internet. Internet has been the first part of this, bringing people together from all over the world, and through that you can start to change the mindset. But the next step also is kind of connect everyone through the internet of everything, and that's when it becomes really scary. They actually was involved in a project called the Noosphere project that discusses brain-computer interfaces and how people would be connected to this in the future. And we started some pilot projects. So it's very, very, very strange things. When I found out this, like I think it's 2010, I was started to investigate this about the Noosphere Forum, and but since things has happened, and as we know, with the fourth industrial revolution, all these technologies that were more or less sci-fi and far out, they were now on the table, and now we have Elon Musk with his hubris projects promoting these things as well.
Yeah, well, in your work, you sort of link a lot of what you discussed about developing this new global consciousness. A lot of the figures involved in that, you've noted, have argued that humanity must merge with technology in order to survive. And of course, one of the most well-known recent proponents of that view is Elon Musk. So can you expand on sort of that particular viewpoint in the context of this and how it might differ from transhumanism and what it ultimately leads to, in your view?
Well, this is Elon Musk. He has talked for a long time about the threat of artificial intelligence
that he's helping develop.
Yes, exactly. So, but in order to survive from the threat of AI, it's better to fuse with it, become one with AI, so we can stand a chance. I think that's the most stupid things I ever heard.
I would tend to agree with you.
And also the thing with Elon Musk as the savior now, and the alternative world. Oh, hooray! Elon is coming here as a superhero, and also, So
Well, he
it's
was placed in the Iron Man movies.
yeah,
And the Iron Man movies had a significant contract with the Pentagon, actually, as
yeah,
part of producing those movies. And at the time, Elon Musk was already a Pentagon contractor. I
yeah,
find that
of
overlap
course.
interesting.
Yeah. You wouldn't come to that far and be that rich if you weren't very well connected to that system from the beginning. So yeah,
Something like that.
yeah,
So anyway, uh do you think it ties in? I know that some of your work on this also has sort of tied in with the New Age movement, and connections to that of this effort to develop a global consciousness as well. And where do you see sort of this transhumanist style thing? We have to merge with machine to survive. Does it connect at all with that sort of related New Age movement that's also tied to some of these
yes,
entities that
yeah,
have
yeah,
come up in
yeah.
your work?
It does. It does. Um, a very if you go into, I've written a lot of this in my book, The Global Coup d'etat. That's another book that was published this autumn by Skyhorse, and I wrote a lot about the New Age movement and how they are. It's kind of they give another version of uh, the Klaus Schwab world, the fourth industrial revolution. They have their own kind of hip technocracy and hip and space technocracy. So you always end up with this if you go into the proponents of these new age ideas. It's always about um, fantastic space technologies that's going to save. We just rebranded the fourth industrial revolution and given a more fluffy way. But we can also find in New Age, I mean, New Age comes from something, it comes from the occult world. It's a lot of, I mean, the term New Age is Alice Bailey and the theosophy. And we find connection also to Crowley and a lot
Mm-hmm.
of that's what I write about in my the book that comes out in December, the book called Temple of Solomon, where I explain the occult background to all of these ideas, and that's basically the transhuman ideas. It's about perfecting perfecting yourself, become a better person, uh, and that, of course, that can be a good thing. Everybody wants to be a better person, but it's very and I state that in the book, it's impossible to become perfect. But with the help of technology, this has we can find it in like Freemasonry, for example, and other these secret societies that talk about this, and we have also authors that has connected this with technology development that goes hand in hand with these ideas, these philosophies of perfection and how it can be achieved. So I have that has been one of the things that I wanted to do for a long time, because I started very like 15 years ago with environmental movement and how they were funded by the oil industry. But I soon found out that there was a lot of things going on connected to the New Age world and with occult significance, and also that the technological development of the world has almost also be almost always been very close to occult ideas. Uh, and we can just take example Nikola Tesla and so on. They had people that have almost occult abilities also. So it's a very very I found when I was doing the research a very very interesting story that goes back a long time.
Great. Well, thanks for sharing that. I definitely think it's worth looking into, especially in the context of the whole Temple of Solomon thing, because I think I was really interested to read in your work I forget exactly who it was, but a particular figure in his view felt that the rebuilding of the so-called third temple of Solomon, was to have essentially all of humanity like linked up through technological means and sort of develop some sort of like shared hive mind.
Yeah, that's Oliver Reiser, that I
Hmm.
have been written a lot about. And Oliver Reiser, he had some students. One of them was Irving Laszlo that I mentioned.
Yeah, I just find that interesting in the context of a lot of what's going on right now. For example, in Israel and Palestine, and even a lot of appointees in the incoming Trump administration rather openly signaling their desire to see the third temple rebuilt, and also figures in the current Netanyahu-led Israeli government saying that as well, and a lot of what the significance that would have in eschatology, and sort of this other view propagated here about the idea that it's really about creating like this internet of bodies, fourth
Yes.
industrial
Yeah,
revolution kind of
it is. It all
hive mind
connects.
paradigm.
Yeah.
And it's interesting when you consider too that the first prime minister of Israel, David Ben Gurion, was predicted, quote unquote, in the 1960s that the future a future world government would emerge, and Jerusalem would be its capital. And sort of he also had interesting views on the quote unquote third temple and what that would mean. So definitely a lot to consider there, especially when you consider that there's a lot of overt signaling from people like Peter Thiel and figures
Yeah.
that he funds in alternative media about the age of the Antichrist is here, and things of that nature, and
Yeah.
how things are going. I think people are going to be taken for quite the ride.
Yeah, they
If
will.
there's if that indicates anything. I mean, if you've someone like Peter Thiel, like, steering committee guy on Bilderberg,
Bilderberg,
and
yeah.
yeah, and a big backer of, the current incoming vice president
Yeah.
of the United
Mm.
States, and things like that, openly saying, the Antichrist is almost here, guys. Um,
Yes.
it's very strange times. So definitely interesting to consider some of these occult things too. And also, in terms of just the development of Zionism in general, it's interesting that Theodor Herzl, who's often considered the father of
Yeah.
Zionism, he was actually in his early days anyway, promoting Zionism, really sort of handled by a British diplomat. Who I believe his name was William Heckler, who happened to be a Freemason obsessed with rebuilding Solomon's
Yeah.
temple in the
Mm.
Middle East.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of history there.
I guess it's connections to the round table movement as well.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right. So
Mm.
I think anyone interested in that should definitely check out your book in December. And I've written some on these issues in the past, and we'll put that in the show notes as well for anyone interested. So thanks so much for your time today, Jacob. And I was wondering if you could share with my audience where they can find your books and your work, and how they can support you.
Yes. Well, you can find some of our books and the new one at my own web store. You can find it through jacobnordangard.se. But you can also find my books at the Enemy Store, Amazon, uh, or Sky, or directly from Skyhorse. And I have two books out that is released in United States now. That's Rockefeller Controlling the Game and The Global Coup d'etat. And this third one can only be bought directly from me, because it's a very, very special book, limited edition, and also contains actually a soundtrack by my own band. I try to do it's a kind of an art project as well, and I have wanted to kind of express. I have worked with an artist, an illustrator, and wanted to make something that is genuinely creative, instead of this AI stuff that is coming all the time now, and
Hmm.
just to promote true humanity, And so that's I always wanted to connect these things, my writing things with my artistic side. So that's a special project. That's been a
That's
very
very commendable, and I think a model that other people in media should follow, and instead of embracing the quote unquote convenience of AI generated products as much as
and
possible.
also support people. That's one of the things that I want to do. I want to support other artistic people and give them the chance to come out with a work and actually earn something from it. So I think it's important that we help each other with this as well.
Well, I definitely agree with that view. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you to everyone who tuned into this episode. If you enjoyed it, please share it around. And please consider supporting this podcast. We couldn't do it without you. Thanks so much, everybody, and catch you all in the next episode.